My name is Buck, B-U-C-K. My last name is Cole, C-O-L-E. I am a retired U.S. and Texas history teacher. And after I retired 16 years ago from the classroom, I became the K through 12 education coordinator at the Texas General Land Office Archives. How many of you ever heard of that place? Okay, great. I was their educator on staff for 10 years, and it was a lot different than being a middle school teacher, which is tantamount to herding chickens, if anybody's ever done it. But for 10 years when I was with the archives, I had the time and the attention to read some incredible personal letters from soldiers, sailors, settlers, men, women, young, old, that I just kind of, over time, just kind of fell in love with these people, you know, because they're like us. And personal letters are my passion in history. That is what I love to read more than anything, except the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, which I think we need to reread again, but never mind. But I love to read the stories of us. And that is why I have the simplest history website on the internet called historify.co, where I post one personal letter every month and give the context and the backstory. It's like a 3-minute read, because I know my attention span is not what it used to be. So I don't want anybody to have to slog through a bunch of detail. So you can read it in about 3 minutes. I do it every month. I'm about to put out another one in a couple of days. No, I'm selling nothing. I sell nothing, okay? So there's no something to click and all that stuff. You just scroll right through it in 3 or 4 minutes. But I do believe that we need to get back to historical facts. I understand the myth of history, I do. I understand the efficacy of myth in history, I do. But I really believe that we need to get back to reading the sources of people like us who lived through eras that we need to know more about. I will tell you this right up front, a confession, that 7:30 is beginning to be late for me, okay? My wife will tell you that, so you being here is an honor for me, for sure. I just want you to know that. How many of you have been to Gettysburg? That's what I thought. That's what I thought. I'm going to Westminster. These people are educated in good places. I need to, just a couple, 3 of you, I need to get your impression. Some of you have probably been there years ago. I was there a couple of years ago for the first time. But I need to get your impression of what you remember most about that visit. Would anybody like to share that? Anyone? Anyone? Yes, sir.
In 2001, I went up there, visiting Pennsylvania, and I do remember how they really showed a lot of detail about who fought who.
Okay.
And how confusing it was.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about some confusion in just a minute.
Yeah,
Anybody else? Anybody else have a recollection of Gettysburg? I was, yes, sir.
Well, there was an image of thousands of men crossing an open field into a line of fire.
We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Some of the spots like Little Round Top and things like that, just the steepness of the hill and how just physically taxing it would have been, each of the parts that you read about, just to make ground, to cover ground would have been very hard, especially in the heat of summer.
You don't know that till you see it yourself. Yeah. When I saw it a couple of years ago for the first time, and as a history, I'm ashamed I didn't make it sooner. I went there for my 70th year. And I told the guide, he'd been doing it for 30 years. We went to day 1, day 2, day 3, you know? And he said, this is Devil's Den, which I thought was unbelievable, a hellhole, you know? And then they had to go to the valley and up the hill to fight the 20th and 17th Maine. How in God's name did they get up there at all? There's a personal letter that says we were 20 paces away from victory. A Confederate soldier wrote that to his mom. We were 20 paces away from victory. You don't read that in the textbooks. It's all about troop movements and all that kind of stuff. But that's what I'm talking about. You know, is the visceral understanding of what war means from a personal point of view, and we're going to talk about that today. I want to start with this. I saw this statue of Robert E. Lee, and I'd seen it in books forever. I had no idea how big it was. That thing is enormous. And there's a drive area behind it. And my guide let me off there. I said, I'd like to walk Pickett's charge if that's okay. It had been raining a little bit, raining that day. I was the only one in the field. He said, sure, I'll just meet you on the other side. So he went around to Cemetery Ridge, and I walked that thing. I just, that monument of that great general, okay, regardless of your politics, he is an unbelievable defensive genius when it comes to war and the strategies and defensive and tactical strategies. But why that man decided on the third day of the battle to line up 12,000 men a mile wide and march like you're in a parade up that hill, almost a mile in the teeth of 80 cannon. What got into him? And as I walked that, Lee and Meade and Longstreet, those names kind of left my brain. And I began to think about those poor souls with those rifles marching, getting blown to bits. At the end of that battle, at the end of Pickett's charge, almost half of his men did not come back. He lost a third of his men in that 3-day battle, and he never really recovered the losses. So what is it that we need to learn about this battle? And I think we can learn so much from those men and one woman that you'll never get in the textbooks. And that's what I want to talk about today, the personal stories of those men who went to 3 days of hell for political reasons, okay? There's some things I need to talk to you about before we go into anything. 3 things you need to know about this era. One is the vast majority of these men were not professional soldiers. They were volunteers. Here's an example. Johnny whoever from Georgia signs up for a regiment. He gets a musket, maybe some clothes. He must have to bring his own. He signs an oath to the Confederacy. He's a soldier that day. They learn how to march. They learn how to march in line. They learn how to march in, But that's about it. I cannot stress enough that these were not professional men. They were not professional soldiers. Almost every one of them was a volunteer. Very little training, and they went off to war. It's very important to understand that. The other thing that I found very comforting, that the literacy rate among Northern Union soldiers was upwards of 90%. They can read and write and comprehend. 90% of the average soldier could do that. That's amazing. But those numbers, I don't know what the numbers are today, but 90% of literacy rate for the rank and file soldier is extremely high. And in the South, it was over 80%. It wasn't as high as the North because the North did not, the South did not have access to, they were rural for sure, that's part of it, but they did not have access to the best of education. And the one thing we need to mention right off the bat is our black Americans, where it was against the law to teach them to read and write. So as we talk about the Civil War, we also need to understand and recognize the darkest moments of our history were those years. So I do not in any sense want to omit the African Americans from this story, but it is a story that is told through the eyes of the Union and Confederate soldiers. Okay, and there's a story later on I'll share with you. And one other thing, these men were extremely religious. Thousands of Bibles were handed out, north and south. And when you read their letters, you see the divine in just about everything. You know, and everything was God's will. Whether you lived or died was God's will. Whether you won the battle or not was God's will. I read one not long ago that says, I think we killed 1,000 Yankees. Thanks be to God. He must have been Methodist. And, I mean, that's the way they talked. They saw battle, they saw war with the hand of God. And they were very, very religious. And I read not long ago, a theologian said, this country has never been that religious before or after. The war changed a lot of men religiously and theologically after the war. But during the war, so many of them were very, very religious. Let's see. The Battle of Gettysburg is 3 days, July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, was a cataclysmic event that fundamentally altered the lives of men who fought there. To understand the ordinary soldier's experience, we have to look past the grand strategy and into the grit, terror, and exhaustion recorded in their letters and diaries. I'm going to give you some quotes. I'm not going to read whole letters, but I'm going to give you some quotes of some real visceral experiences. And I don't do that for dramatic effect. I only do that, I only bring forward these quotes because if we don't understand what the average soldier goes through, then I don't think we can really understand the war. It's absolutely tragic what happens in these 3 days. Those records are my passion, like I told you, because they are honest, unguarded, democratic, young, old, rich, poor, male, female, all have something to contribute to history. Before the battle even started, there's a 15-year-old girl that wrote her observations of Confederate troops. They are filthy dogs. Their hair is long, they haven't had a bath. I don't know when's the last time they changed their clothes. They look like wolves. 15 years old, she's a resident of Gettysburg. But there's a young private from North Carolina. He comes up here, and the first time he's been north. He goes through Maryland and southern Pennsylvania, and he writes back to his brother. Most of these people up here are Dutch, and they're the ugliest people I've ever seen. I have not seen a pretty woman in Yankee territory. The women in Virginia are much more beautiful. So even before they start shooting at each other, you see what's going on, okay? They just don't like each other. Let's see. Here we go. I just want to show you this information gap real quick, and this is just an example of why I think we should put more personal letters into the hands of kids in our history classes. This is a staff report. The 20th Michigan engaged the enemy at 10 a.m. Now, I know that's not very interesting, but it's absolutely necessary. If you're a command officer, that's the kind of information you've got to have, right? In that same engagement, here's a personal letter from a soldier. The blood was so thick in the grass it soaked through my socks. One is an official record. One is an official report. But the second quote, you lean into it because that's a story. How in God's name can that happen? Your socks are soaked with blood as you're walking across the battlefield. That's an amazing story. That is something that we lean into. Just for just for understanding purposes, I actually, and I want to admit that right now, I created this map on AI because I could not find one that was simple enough for me to understand. There was so much troop movement, I was like, I'm going nuts here. So I said, I'll just print this. I gave it the instructions, and this is what it came out with, okay? And I promise you, it's the only AI thing I've done in this presentation. I swear to God, I haven't done anything else. But what I think is it's very important that we understand this map as we go along. This is a 3-day battle. We're going to talk about what happened at McPherson's barn. We're going to talk about what happened in the town of Gettysburg. We're going to talk about what happened at Little Round Top. Of course, Colts Hill was just as bad a fight as Little Round Top, but this had much more significance. And we're going to talk about the troop movements over here in the south and where Lee lined up his men for that 3rd-day fatal charge at Pickett's charge. It's actually called something else. Trimble something charge. There's actually 3 of them. But I want to show you this real quick. The Union came from the north. And if you look at this map, the Union Army came up from the east because they're trying to protect Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The Southerners hid behind mountains over here and came up from this way. All roads were leading to Gettysburg, as you see. The first ones to get there were the Union. They got here, and they know that the rebels are coming from the north. And so what they do is they put up defensive positions, and then I'll show you something in just a second. But as that were happening during the day, reinforcements kept coming in on the Union side as the rebels were coming from this direction. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the rest of it. That's where the Union set up their defensive line. They set one up here in front of McPherson's barn, but they were beginning to be overwhelmed. When the firing started, the rebels kept coming, and they kept coming. And the Union troops had to retreat through the town. Once they got into the town, they skedaddled up that Cemetery Hill, up to Cemetery Ridge. And why the Confederates did not follow them up there, they didn't. They stopped fighting in Gettysburg itself. And overnight, the Union forces came in and they created a defensive position. They call it the fish hook, but I drew this. That's the lousiest fish hook I've ever seen in my life. But they are behind that blue line, and they are reinforcing. They are reinforcement during the night to reinforce all of that area that you see behind that blue line. The second day, Lee says we're going to try their right flank, and for all day long they fought like dogs, and the Union was able to hold them back. Just at the same time, Little Round Top, and that's what I'm going to focus on, they fought like dogs, and the Union held them back. The thing that was against Lee from the very beginning was he did not have the high ground. The Union had the high ground, okay? So what does he do? He can't do anything here after day 2. He can't do anything here after day 2. So he decides that he's going to have a frontal assault on day 3. They're reinforcing their flanks. I'm going to go right in the middle. And his general, Longstreet, told him, "Sir, I have been a soldier for decades. No 10,000 men can take Cemetery Ridge." And Lee looked at him and said, "I'm going to go there this afternoon." And you know what happens. This is his line on the 3rd day. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he orders a walk across a mile with 12 to 13,000 men. And half of them don't come back. So we're going to talk about that. This is McPherson's barn today. It's a tranquil scene. It took place at the very first day of the battle, in the morning, by the way. And Private Charles Reed from 9th Massachusetts. Now, the rebel forces are coming from the left. The Union forces are arrayed in a defensive position on the right. That statue in the background is a Union general who was killed in action. They erected a statue in his honor. This is what Private Charles Reed, 9th Massachusetts, has to say on that fateful battle. Reed's letters often captured the strange, detached feeling of being under fire. He wrote to his family about the transition from a quiet morning to chaos. The air was full of missiles. It seems as if a million bees were humming in the air. We went through the motions of loading and firing like we were machines. But the smell of sulfur and the sight of the horses being torn to pieces by the shells is something that will never leave my eyes. Religious references abound too, like this one from the Confederate soldier on the left in Archer's Brigade. It was nothing but the hand of the Almighty that shielded me. The bullets whistled like a gale of wind, and many a brave boy who woke with me that morning is now sleeping his last sleep in the Pennsylvania soil. It is His will, God's will, that I should, if it is God's will that I should fall next, I hope to meet you in a better world than this one. And this one, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes, 6th Wisconsin. He's on the right defending Gettysburg. His personal letters to his wife Mary reveal the human toll of the fight for the barn, and they are so well written. This is what he says. The slaughter was terrible. My dead and wounded were scattered all over the field. I saw a boy, not more than 18, crawling toward the shelter of the McPherson barn, trailing a shattered leg behind him. He wasn't crying. He was just looking for a place to hide from the sun, and he died later. And that's just a few. That's just a few of the letters that you'll find even at the fighting at McPherson Bridge. This one, when they're going through town, and by the way, when the Union soldiers were retreating, they're running through the town up the hill, and a lot of them were getting shot in the back by the Confederate soldiers. But for some reason, the Confederates chose not to go up that hill and chase them. They could have ended the battle right there, maybe. But they met stiff resistance up on the hill, and they retreated. And so Lee regathered his forces back on Seminary Ridge to the west, and he occupied the town during the three-day battle. But this is what Private G.W. Nichols said to 61st Georgia. He said, we drove the Yankees through town. The ladies were waving handkerchiefs from the windows. Though whether they were glad to see us or just scared to death, I couldn't tell. I found a loaf of bread in the kitchen and ate it while I was loading my rifle. The Confederate forces always were short on supply to eat stuff, always in short supply. They found the body of a 14-year-old boy who died in battle. And they checked his pockets, and he had 4 acorns from an acorn tree that he had roasted, and that's all he had to eat. I mean, they were chronically short of food and clothing and other, and a lot of these Confederate soldiers were barefoot. You know, so, and I'm going to tell you a story in just a minute about some of that. But then there's a girl here, and her name is Nellie Wagenbach, and she is a young girl whose family was huddling in a cellar in the town square. How many of you been to the town square? That's a beautiful place, just gorgeous. But this is what she writes. Oh, sorry. Let's see. Here it is. Anyway, she says, they were down in the cellar with their family, and the thud of bullets were just ricocheting off the house, and this was scaring everybody. And she says, the thing that bothered her the most is it was knocking the jelly preserves off the shelves. And y'all know what I'm talking about, right? How many of you grew up with preserves and jellies that you made at home? We did in Waco, I'm telling you that. Mother didn't buy brand jelly till I was, I don't know, 20, you know? But they were falling off the shelves. She said, there goes our sweets, you know? And she could smell sulfur coming from the floor. The shells were coming at them so hard. It's a remarkable story. She lived to be an old age to tell a lot more than that. But this is the one I wanted to show you. And by the way, I do apologize for the cars being there. I don't know whether they're Confederate or Union. But this is the best shot I saw of Devil's Den and Little Round Top. What you see at the top there, that big monument there, is the 20th Maine. That's where they were positioned at the far left. If they were to lose that position, the Confederates are going to turn that flank and go right down that hill, and it's over. That battle is over, and they tried 3 or 4 or 5 times to take that hill, and they couldn't do it because of the 20th Maine, and they had a lot of ammunition, but 20th Maine was not in good shape either. South of the town, the struggle for the high ground was beginning. We always hear about the heroic bayonet charge of the 20th Maine, but if you read the letters in the ranks, they don't talk about heroism. Let's see. I wish I could get this thing. There we go. Yeah, here we go. If you read the letters of the men in the ranks, they don't talk about heroism. They talk about thirst. They talk about being hungry. They talk about where's John. Private John Haley of the 17th Maine was positioned nearby. His journal entry for July 2nd is famously cynical. He cuts through the glory and honor talk that would dominate history books decades later, and this is what he says. The sun was a furnace. We had been without water for hours, and our tongues were swollen so thick we could hardly speak. When the order came to move, we didn't feel like defenders of the Union. No one cared. We felt like cattle being driven into a fire. There is no glory in a dry throat and a gut full of fear. Another account from the 17th Maine, or 20th Maine. I looked at my brother as we reached the crest. He was bleeding from a scratch on his cheek, but was grinning like a demon. We didn't speak. We just leaned our shoulders together and kept firing. It was the last time I saw my brother standing up. And then Private James Sullivan, 4th Texas Infantry, wrote this, describes the sensory horror of the second day. And he brings up something I mentioned earlier. The smoke was so thick, you couldn't see the sun. Only a dull copper disc in the sky. The screaming wasn't just men. It was the horses. A wounded horse has a cry that sounds almost human, and it rose above the roar of the cannon. And then this is a story I think needs to be told in a little more depth. The 15th Alabama Regiment. Anybody here from Alabama? Okay, so I can really tell it.
Yeah.
They were ordered on the second day at 3 o'clock in the morning to march to Gettysburg. They needed one more regiment. So the 15th Alabama at 3 in the morning got up, meager breakfast, and they marched, quick time, 25 miles to Gettysburg. By the time they got there, they were exhausted. They were dehydrated. They were hungry. Their feet were bleeding. And a few minutes later, their commander, Colonel Oates, said, "We're going to take that hill." So there was other regiments there from Mississippi and Texas, but they got the call on the far right side. And he called his men to charge, and some of them were still asleep underneath the trees. They were just beat. These men got up, and he said they were like ghosts going up that hill, and they were mowed down. It was just a slaughter, and I don't think we understand just the effect and the impact of a person's physical stamina, that when you don't eat and you don't drink water and you don't do the things you need to do, how that affects someone going to take a position up there on Little Round Top. And I have a quote from a young man that happened to live through that, and this is what he said. "We had to leave our wounded in the hands of the Yankees. It makes my heart ache to think of them lying there without their friends to care for them. We did all that men could do, but the hill was too steep and the enemy too strong. The hill was too steep and the enemy was too strong." What doesn't he mention? We were tired. We were exhausted. We were thirsty. We were hungry. And I don't care what your politics are about the Civil War. That is a very human experience. You're not thinking about the lost cause or saving the Union. You're thinking about staying alive. And many of these men died on that 25-mile march. And how did that affect the battle? Certainly it affected in some way. And one of them said, we were 20 paces away from victory. If we could have gone 20 more paces, we could have got to the top of that hill. But the fire just beat us up. And so the personal story is not only about the visceral things, the smells and all that. It's also about how and what shape were these men were in when they went to battle. And when you're not eating and you have no water to drink, certainly it's bound to affect any outcome of any battle. Is that yours? If it's the grandkids, on this. This is, show you this quickly here. I think this might be my picture. I'm such a bad photographer. But this is the statue of Robert E. Lee. That's where he was sitting on Traveler when he called the charge at Pickett's charge. These are the line of trees that the Confederate soldiers were hiding behind, or not hiding, but they were out of view. And up here were the cannon that were arrayed here. And by the way, they had artillery over there. I'll talk about that in a minute. But then from here to here is 1 mile. And when they came out of the woods, they were lined up like they were going down a parade Congress Avenue. Shouldered their muskets, you know. But they were doing something that I think they had a premonition. One thing they were doing is they were shaking the hands of their best friends. They were writing notes about who they were on a piece of paper and pinning them to their shirts. The guys in the ranks knew what's coming up. And one of them said, we just knew that we were walking on the dirt where we're going to be buried. They said prayers. They hugged each other. And Lee said, line up. Before they did, there was a cannon exchange. They said the world shook from one end to the other. The cannon from the artillery of the Confederacy fired at the Yankees. The Yankees fired back their cannon. But something happened. Two things happened. One, the artillery commander for the Confederates didn't get a good gauge where the Union was, and he kept overshooting the lines of the Yankees. The artillery commander for the North said about 45. This was almost an hour-long barrage, by the way. And the Union artillery commander said, "Stop firing. We got to save our ammo." And it's at that point when everything was calm that they came out of the woods. And what the artillery commander did right here was array 80 cannon aimed right at him. 80 cannon aimed right at Pickett's men, Trimble's men, and there was another one as well. 10,000 men arrayed along that line. And they like this, and they marched just like this. Right into they're like bowling pins, waiting to get knocked down. And I want to share some of those stories with you right now. The heat was a physical weight, but the soldiers don't write about the heat as much as they write about the silence. Before the great cannonade, the greatest cannonade in American history, there was a stillness that felt unearthly. Lieutenant Frank Haskell of the 2nd Wisconsin was on Cemetery Ridge right here, where that wall is. Waiting, his letter home, is a masterpiece of honest observation. The air was still and sultry. Not a leaf stirred. It was a silence that made one's heart beat so loud. We knew the storm was coming, but the waiting was worse than the fighting. Men were lighting pipes with shaky hands, not speaking, just looking across that mile of open field at the woods where the rebels were hiding from us. In history books, we jump straight to the roar of the guns. Haskell reminds us of the waiting, the minute-by-minute terror of men who knew they were likely standing on their own graves. When the charge finally came, the glory was lost in a literal fog of lead. We see the paintings of neat lines and waving flags. The survivors, like Private John Dooley of the 1st Virginia, saw something much more fragmented and terrifying. I saw the shells bursting in our ranks, tearing great gaps that were closed as soon as they were made. We were not marching, we were stumbling over our own friends. The air was so full of dust and smoke I could not see the man to my left. I only knew he was gone when I felt his blood spray across my cheek. There was no music for us, and certainly no cheering. Dooley's account isn't about the lost cause or Southern valor. It's about the cruel reality of walking through a meat grinder. And every man who was there knew that. And this is a soldier from the 71st Pennsylvania. This is what he had to say. As the rebels reached our wall, one young fellow, not more than 16, fell right at my feet. He cried out for his mother. I reached over the stone and gave him a drink of my canteen. He smiled, closed his eyes, and he was gone. I cried for him right there in the middle of the fight. Independent personal letters from men who fought on both sides when they're laying there wounded. There were 3 things that they hollered: water, God help me, and most of all, what did they holler?
Mother.
Mother. Mother. One guy said, I had to plug my ears with cotton. I could not sleep for hearing it. I don't know about you guys, or you ladies even, but if something were to happen to me, I'm calling for my mom too. I'm just going to say it, you know. And I think we know why. You know, the nurturing aspect and everything. You know how dads can be, but you know how moms can be, right? On the 4th day, the 4th of July, Lee had had enough. Meade's army was beaten up too. But on the 4th day, Lee stood his ground, waiting for General Meade to counterattack with his Union force. He never did. Because Meade looked around and said, I don't have enough men to fight back, to chase Lee back down to Virginia. This is a drawing made by a Confederate soldier of what it looked like. They loaded up the wagons with supplies that they had stolen from the countryside, which, by the way, Confederate soldiers were very impressed with Yankee farms. They had never seen such produce in their lives. And they loaded up supplies, and they're wounded. They loaded up 8,000 wounded and dying Confederates in those wagons. They left 6,000 men at Gettysburg on Pennsylvania soil. That wagon train was 17 miles long. And they were worried the whole time that Meade would come after him. And when Lincoln heard about it, Lincoln was furious. We could end this war today if you'll go get him. General Meade go after Lee. A week later he said this. He was furious. He wrote a letter and said, I don't know what kind of cowardice got into you or whatever. But Lincoln, being Lincoln, thought about what he was going to do. He knew about the carnage and the killing and the misery and the horror. And he never sent it. We still have it in the archives. But he never sent that letter. That tells you the kind of man that he is. It dawned on him. He's thought about it twice. It's like when we're writing an email to somebody we don't like. You know what I'm talking about. You know, you just want to send this email, boy, I'm going to, and then you get up and walk around and you go, no, I better not. I'll modify it or not send it at all. I've been there, I guess, you know. It's the same thing. That great man had second thoughts. He said, we'll get them somehow, you know. And 17 miles long. This is a quote from one of the men that were on that retreat. Back through Maryland, back into Virginia, where they could be safe, and this is what he says. We are wading through mud to our knees, leaving our brave boys behind in Pennsylvania soil. My heart is heavy, not for the cause, not for the lost cause, but for the faces I'll never see around the campfire again. We gave them all we had, but it just wasn't enough. And when you read the letters of independent of each other, you see kind of the same thing. We gave it everything we had. And when the men came back from Pickett's charge, Lee got off the Traveler, his horse, and apologized to him. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. 6,000 dead were left. And by the way, the Union hospitals actually took care of Confederate wounded as well. So there was not only their wounded, but also the Confederate wounded. Quote kind of sums it up. This lady needs to be in the textbook, I'll tell you that. Her name is Cornelia Hancock. After the battle, the real horror was just beginning. The dead and dying were everywhere. Cornelia Hancock, a 23-year-old Quaker nurse, arrived while the field was still smoking. Her letters home are a stark correction to any romantic view of the war. She says this, I am now in a hospital. If you can call a row of tents in a muddy field a hospital, the smell is something that I cannot describe. It cannot be described. It is the smell of rotting flesh and unwashed bodies. I have seen sights that I hope no other woman ever has to see. My hands are stained so deep with blood that it seems it will never wash off. The groans of the dying are the only music we hear day and night. She lived to be 76 years old. She died in 1921. And one of her last letters that she wrote before she died said that those experiences and those visions have never left me. And then just imagine how the soldiers felt. What do you do when you go home back to Tyler, Texas, in 1865? What do you tell them? You know, we didn't have that tough a time in Texas. We really didn't. Along the coast, the Yankees tried, the Union people tried to come in, but, you know, we fought, they took the island Galveston once and we took it back. I mean, as a population, we really didn't suffer that much, except in terms of our men. We sent 90,000 men, Texas did, into the Confederate States of America. And we were also supplied them corn, beef, I mean, we were, you know, all that. But the devastation that you saw in places like Gettysburg and Virginia were nothing like it. In Texas, we had nothing even comparable to something like that. Well, let's talk about remembrance. 28,000 Confederates killed, wounded, or missing. 23,000 Union killed, wounded, or missing. That's 51,000 casualties on the official report. But it's also 51,000 stories that may or may not be told. But why do we bother to remember this stuff? Why is this important? Why can't we just be satisfied with what's in the newspaper or what's on the TV? Why are these stories? How does this help us, motivate us to do anything? Anybody?
It makes you wonder, you stop, when you read about the anguish, the pain, the brutality, you've got to ask the question, was it worth it?
Was it worth it, you know?
And if we ask that about perhaps every war, if we really got the facts, like we're talking about, it might change a few people's minds.
A lot of the soldiers, when they were older men, 70s, 80s years old, they would think about this battle and this war. And some of them died from wounds that happened 40 years before. You know? General Longstreet died from wounds that he received during the Civil War. But when they look back at it, one guy said, I don't care what your politics are, when you see men die, screaming in horror, it makes us want to work for peace that much harder, because we never want to see that again. And so when we go to war, how many veterans out here? Thank you for your service. When we go to war, we want to make sure that we are the people in charge of the commander-in-chiefs and all the generals, everybody, that we're doing the best we can if we have to fight to keep this to a minimum. And we've never had this kind of carnage before or since. Gettysburg is the largest battle ever fought on American soil. So I just want to leave you with this quote. Gettysburg, and this is Captain William Wheeler of the 3rd, he was New York Artillery Battery. He was one of the batteries firing at the Confederate soldiers. He said Gettysburg was won and lost by the steady nerves of men who were tired, hungry, and terrified. It wasn't the generals who held the line. It was the boys who refused to run when the earth was shaking. No one can question their courage, no matter what happens. That's why I am so thankful for the letters that we have, because we need to get more of these out. Not just, it could be any war. It doesn't have to be the Civil War. It could be any war. World War I, Vietnam. And you know, in some ways, I think Vietnam is still an open wound for many people. You know, my aunt, I lost my uncle there, and my aunt never remarried. She never even bothered to date. She had a 5-year-old daughter to take care of, you know? And that's what we don't see when we're not part of this. We don't see when the birthday rolls around and he or she is not there, you know? There's a deep, deep understanding of what loss is. And I think that we need to, these letters do that. It's not about telling the gore. It's about giving the experiences and hoping that at some point in our future, we never have to see it again. I thank you for your time.
I'd like to say something. I attended a seminar, Pat and I attended a seminar a few years back about the Civil War. And a distinguished professor from TCU, who was a history professor specializing in the Civil War, he said, and this is what he said, most of the history we have of the Civil War, the real history, comes from the letters written back and forth from home to the battlefield. And he said, he went on to say, people do not realize how important these letters are, not only of the Civil War, but of all the events of our time. And when you get like a war or something like that, correspondent, you should contact some university professor and ask him if he'd like to have it.
That's a great idea. Folks, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. If you Google historify.co, you'll see what it is. You go, oh, this is simple. So I can read the documents and the story behind them in the context. So please do that. I post it every
Wait,
month.
say everything again?
Historify.co. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much.